Greetings and salutations, friends! It is finally time for the Primaris Rant. This will be a semi-lore, semi-talking about Primaris video, so I figured it had deserved the Friday spot. Especially considering I've been making you guys wait for this for a very long time as well. But I kind of wanted to see precisely how the Primaris were going to shake out before I really got into them. And so today we're going to talk about the Primaris Marines, both about their fluff, where it just absolutely makes no sense, where it kind of possibly makes some sense, and how it could have been done a lot better. And finally, we'll round it off by talking a bit about their design, which, whilst it certainly is cool, I worry that it might have lost a little bit of that 40k that the old Space Marines so perfectly exemplified. Oh, and also, consider this basically a pure podcasty level thing, with the sheer amount of stuff I want to go through with this, video? No, sound recording, honestly. There's not really going to be a whole lot of visuals here, I'm afraid. I will be making it up to you, though. I know I've been a bit lazy the last couple of weeks. I have had so much goddamn shit to deal with, and I feel like I've taken way too many breaks already, so I have been on the lazy side with the visuals. I do have a series coming up, though, which I think you'll like, with a fair bit of custom art again. Just a mini-series, don't get excited. We're not starting the Badab Crusade just yet. But, without further ado, let's get on with it. So with all disasters, we are going to start at the beginning, so as to better understand what went wrong, where it went wrong, and how we can avoid it in the future. It all began with a relatively good idea. Roboute Guilliman was sitting in the undoubtedly bombed-out remains of the Imperial Palace on Terra after the end of the First Heresy, and thought to himself, wow, that was awfully close, wasn't it? Maybe we should avoid this happening again. And so, as a first step towards that goal, he wrote the Codex Astartes, which broke the legions up into much smaller, much more manageable chapters. A chapter was still a significant fighting force, and it would retain enough flexibility to be able to fulfill most tasks given to it by the Imperium of Man. But crucially, a single chapter, or even an alliance of a dozen chapters, would not possess even an iota of the full force of a legion. And so even if several chapters all turned renegade at the same time, and coordinated against the wider Imperium, they would still not be able to do anywhere even remotely close to the amount of damage that Horus had managed. And additionally, splitting the Legiones Astartes into smaller chapters would make it much more difficult for the corruption to spread in the first place. Maybe the corruption overcomes a chapter, alright. Well, that's still only 1,000 Battle Brothers, a formidable force to be sure, but now a fully chaotic chapter is going to have to spread that corruption to yet another chapter, which in all due likelihood will have entirely different traditions and norms and rituals to the chaotic chapter, vastly complicating the process of actually spreading the chaos corruption, particularly when one considers the warping influence of chaos. As most loyal Battle Brothers would think twice before trusting a brother from another chapter who seems to be articulating his words with the help of a second mouth, located roundabout where his sphincter was supposed to be. And whilst in the midst of conjuring up that particular mental image, Roboute Guilliman thought to himself, oh right, sphincters. That's potentially a little bit of an issue, because a lot of my grudge-bearing brothers fled into the galactic sphincter known as the Eye of Terror. Now, my loyalist brothers all assure me that nobody could ever possibly survive inside of that maelstrom of madness. They assure me, every last one of them, that anything that comes even within a million light years of that hellhole immediately gets pumped. That being the technical term, by the way, for what happens to a human when he gets close to the Eye of Terror. Imagine a hamster, if you will, that you place inside of a microwave on maximum effect for about 1:30, and you'll get a general idea. However, Guilliman had also seen a lot of his brothers and their children changed. Spikes, tentacles, assholes in odd places, bulging eyes, near immunity to poison, exceptional flatulence, so on and so on. And his big Primarch brain was telling him that if his brothers and their children could already bend the rules of nature to such an extent, then maybe, just maybe, they could also exist in an area in which normal people go, pumph, and not go pumph. And if that turned out to be the case, and it also turned out to be the case that the traitors decided to go along with their usual doctrines, instead of being fair about it and also split into smaller chapters, then this would leave the Imperium at a decided disadvantage, as it attempted to fight the force of chaos, still operating in Legion strength, with mere chapters. Something that would be roughly analogous to bringing a squirt gun filled with rose water to a World War I trench. This was a conundrum. How to defeat enemies that simply just didn't want to play fair, while still dealing with the STD that was chaos, and how terribly it spread in a confined area. Well, surely, Guilliman thought, the chapters could simply cooperate to deal with extraordinary threats. Perhaps they could even have secret protocols to resurrect the old Legion doctrines and allow the various chapters to fight in a unified manner. All that it would require, Guilliman thought as he got up his chair and wandered over to a large, mostly intact window, was for the Legionis Astartes to act in a unified manner, with a common purpose and trust in one another. Yes, this would be the answer, Guilliman told himself, as he looked out on ranks upon ranks upon ranks of Imperial fists marching on to dropships to be taken off to the Iron Cage, a planet that had been fortified beyond the realms of possibility by Petarabo, who had finished his work by placing a jumbo-sized sign in orbit above the planet with words painted out in skyscraper-sized neon green letters reading, "Warning, Trap, Nobody but Rogel Dawn enter." And so, whilst witnessing this procession, Guilliman turned away from the window, felt a small blood vessel pop in his head, and thought, no, I'm gonna have to come up with something else. Pacing around the room, Guilliman felt a sense of despair slowly creep up over him. Was there any way for him to have his cake and eat it as well? Some way for him to break up the legions so that they could not possess a further heretical threat to the Imperium of Man, yet still maintain legion-sized formations to resist a potentially unified offensive from the traitor legionnaires? The obvious solution was, of course, to maintain at least one legion, but Guilliman did not think any of his remaining brothers could be trusted with such a responsibility. Dawn was far too stubborn and willful, the Khan far too aloof, too much of an unknown. Vulcan was far too soft and far too changed. Guilliman remembered well the crazed mess he had become. Guilliman had been amongst those trying to hunt him down at one point. Corax was not the sort to lead such a legion, and besides, Guilliman was not sure Corax would be able to save himself, much less the Raven Guard or the Imperium. The Lion was the same, too haunted by the necessary actions taken during the Crusade, and something else as well. There was something off about the Lion now, but Guilliman knew better than to pry in these testy times. And Russ, on the one hand, even Guilliman knew there would be none more loyal to the Emperor, but the Emperor and the Imperium are not necessarily one and the same. Ferrus Manus was dead, and hardly of the right temperament regardless. Sanguinius, the only man Guilliman would have trusted with such a power, he too was gone. And Guilliman? His brothers would never accept that. Not even if the Imperium lasted for another 10,000 years would they accept that. No, there was far too much suspicion around these days, especially for Guilliman, who had, at one point, forged the Imperium Secundus. No, unless he was willing to risk a second civil war, it could not be Guilliman. Back to square one then. How to split up the legions, how to make his brothers accept splitting up the legions, because that too, of course, was a question. Some would be far more willing than others. Korax would support it. The Blood Angels would be almost desperate for any sort of guidance now that their Primarch was gone. But Vulcan? Russ? Dawn? Probably not so much. And eventually, Papa Smurf decided that that was the first problem, convincing his brothers that the adoption of the Codex Astartes was both necessary and to the benefit of the Imperium. And so he started with that problem. Theoreticals and practicals, after all, one problem at a time, one solution at a time, until eventually he ran into a certain adept tech priest, Belisarius Cawl. And this is where shit starts getting ridiculous. Cawl is a ridiculous character. I'm sorry, but he is just... Honestly, the way I would describe Belisarius Cawl is... Games Workshop came up with the whole Primaris idea, right? They wrote it, they made it, they had the models ready to go, they were ready to start printing them out in dozens and droves, etc. And then they thought to themselves, shit, we actually need a backstory for this. We need to make these guys separate enough from the usual Space Marines. Because I honestly think that to begin with, this was supposed to just be the new Space Marines, true-scale Space Marines, but they figured that wouldn't fly. Honestly, I think that would have been a better bloody idea, but hey, what do I fucking know? And so they figured in the 11th hour that they need a backstory. So what are we gonna do? Well, let's just take some kind of thingity-bob like Guilliman. He can plan shit, right? He saw this all coming. He saw the galaxy being split in two, and so he gave Cawl a mission to create super soldiers, ultra smurfs, scub marines, so on and so on and so on, and to make millions of the little shits to boot and store them all over the galaxy like a super-powered ultra squirrel of some sort. And whilst that is retarded enough, it does not hold a candle to Cawl. What I imagine happened was this. The head honcho of Games Workshop was sitting in a meeting, and suddenly he thought to himself, shit, we haven't actually made any backstory for the guy who's supposed to do all of this ridiculous nonsense. The guy that's supposed to not only have created millions of super soldiers in secret and squirreled them away across the galaxy, and also improved upon the Emperor's work in less than a millennia, mind, we have nothing on him. And so he turned to a room full of authors and went, make something up. And they immediately started brainstorming away, pitching ideas. Cawl was a scientist that worked on the original Space Marines alongside the Emperor himself. No. He mind-blended with one of the scientists. No. He was a vat-grown clone that was also a genius from birth that instantly knew more than his masters. No. He was on Horus's side during the heresy and then betrayed and devoured the brain of his taskmaster before betraying Horus. No. He was a tech adept that got lost in the warp with tons of secret knowledge and only appeared after the heresy. And this went just on and on, more and more ridiculous ideas until the Games Workshop head honcho, his brain now overloaded from all of the nonsense he was hearing, just clapped his hands. No, we're just gonna do all of those things in one character, okay? I don't care if you can, just make it happen. And that's pretty much how we got Cawl. Because all of those things are Cawl. If we were to call his backstory a tangled clusterfuck constructed from Viagra-fueled koala bears dipped in cheese and fire ants, it would still be like referring to Hiroshima after Little Boy as a mild case of renovation. And so we're not going to be going too deeply into Cawl's fluff in this video because it is just too much of a dumpster fire to even get started on. All you really need to know is that after Cawl emerged from the warp post-Horus Heresy, Papa Smurf got a hold of him eventually, and gave him the mission to 1. Pimp up Papa Smurf's wardrobe with an item that could potentially bring him back from the dead at some point, and 2. Create the super soldiers. Because whilst Guilliman had managed to convince his brothers to split their legions into chapters, or most of them at least, I mean, Russ pays lip service to the organizational structure of the Codex Astartes, but, yeah. Anywho, close enough. However, there was still the problem of what to do if the traitor legionnaires returned in legion strength. And since Guilliman could not trust any of his brothers to maintain their legions, and they would never accept him being the only one to maintain his legion, because at this point in time, Guilliman still had a little bit of a flimsy reputation after that whole Imperium Secundus thing and all that. And unable to accept the fact that he could not have his cake and eat it as well, Guilliman did the only reasonable thing as far as he was concerned anywho. He secretly created millions of Space Marines, divided them into chapters, at least as a nod towards his own Codex Astartes, but in all due reality, since he was the only one with the authority to deploy these forces, and he could pick and choose which forces were deployed, in all due essentiality, he created multiple legion-sized formations. If he wished the Primaris Marines to be deployed in the hundreds of thousands under his unified leadership, which he would eventually do, then he could, and did, do so. Yeah, I can't see any reason why his brothers wouldn't trust him either. Such an upstanding guy. Oh me, oh my. This is some Alpha Legion level bullshit right here. But again, I don't necessarily mind this part of it, because the basic idea behind it is a good one. It is a just-in-case oh shit button. But of course, it must also be mentioned that this was an oh shit button that only Guilliman knew about, that only Guilliman could press, and that, quite potentially, only Guilliman could command. Allow me to draw you a little bit of a picture here, just to illustrate the situation. Guilliman had convinced all of his brothers to lay down their assault rifles and instead pick up squirt guns, whilst he himself, whilst also having laid down his assault rifle, had also prepared a nuclear weapon just in case. And of course, he couldn't trust any of his brothers with such power, but himself? Oh, don't be silly. You can trust girly man. So yeah. This undoubtedly makes Guilliman a massive hypocrite, a liar, and some might even say, with a fair degree of legitimacy as well, I might add, a traitor. But don't worry about it. Guilliman would never use this inconceivable power he's hoarded all for himself for evil. He has reassured us of that. And you wouldn't want to question the honesty of the man holding the gun, now would you? Because that's just silly. Though, to be fair to Robot Girly Man, there is evidence to suggest that despite having hoarded the powers of tyranny for his very own, he may not actually want to become the tyrant. Which of course doesn't mean that he won't become the tyrant, it just means that he'll be unwilling to do so when the time comes, but we're digressing somewhat, because when he formed Imperium Secundus, that did not seem to come from any real lust for power, or any real wish to seize authority or guide the Imperium in a specific direction. It seemed to come from a genuine place of concern, a urge and a need to maintain the Imperium in whatever form was possible and seemed most practical at the time. At the end of the day, Guilliman is a die-hard pragmatist, and if he has to, shall we say, compromise his morals, his philosophies, and his ideas to do so if he must become a hypocrite to do what is practical, as we have quite clearly seen, he will do so, and we may certainly judge him from a moral standpoint, but for the moment at least, he does not appear to be wanting to use all of this power he has secretly hoarded for himself for evil. And now we finally arrive at the Primaris Marines themselves, after a mere 20 minutes of preamble. I do think it is important, though, to go over all of that, to give you an understanding that the basic idea behind the Primaris Marines is a relatively sound one, but essentially the moment Cawl steps into the picture, everything gets rather ridiculous. Starting all the way back with the creation of the Primaris Marines. It took the God Emperor, God only knows how many millennia, how many centuries, how many pacts with dark, unknowable forces in the Immaterium to create just the Proto-Astartes, the Thunder Warriors, and then yet another further millennia during the unification war on Terra with ever-growing resources as the entire planet slowly but surely came under his command with all of the additional materiel and scientific expertise that dominion brought with it to finally create the Primarchs and the Astartes themselves. This was an incredibly long, incredibly arduous and difficult process that required not only the Emperor, the most powerful human psyche to have ever existed, but also a vast quantity of highly skilled personnel, brilliant scientists, engineers, and craftspeople, all required to develop and build the Emperor's dream of the Primarchs and the Space Marines. And all of this science would eventually culminate in the creation of the Raptors, given out to try and rebuild the Raven Guard's Legion after their catastrophic losses on Istvan. But despite all of this, despite the titanic undertaking that this was, the sheer amount of talented personnel, the materials required, the hyper-specialized equipment required, the treaties with dark gods it required, despite all of these things, Cawl not only managed to recreate the Raptors, but perfect and improve upon them within a single millennia. Because one of the first foundings of Primaris Marines were the Fulminators, created in the 31st millennia during the Scouring. And since we also know that Cawl re-emerged in the Imperium during the Scouring, and then spent a considerable amount of time before he began work on the Primaris Marines, so whilst we don't have a clear timeline, it appears as if Cawl managed to do all of that in about maybe 800 odd years. A conservative estimate. And I would also like to reiterate once again that Cawl did all of that in secret, ergo without access to the vast resources of the Imperium, without access to specialist personnel or specialist resources and all of that knowledge. Cawl, in all due likelihood, would have access to some of the Emperor's research, but he would have had to create all of the equipment needed himself. And all of the new specialist implements that the Primaris Marines now possess, all of that too was made entirely by Cawl. He didn't just do better than the Emperor. He did it in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the resources, and a fraction of the personnel. Honestly, what the fuck was even the point of the Emperor? If a vat-grown human can not only do what he did, but do better, why the hell was the Emperor such a big deal to begin with? And not happy with merely doing better than the Emperor, Cawl also secretly, and probably without Guilliman's approval, in fact, certainly without Guilliman's approval, also decided to see if he couldn't rectify one of the Emperor's greatest failing, namely, of course, half of his sons falling to chaos. Now, this has of course not been completely confirmed as of yet, but Cawl has shown quite a bit of interest in attempting to reforge the Traitor Legions as well, and use their gene-seed to create Primaris Space Marines. Guilliman has refused any such attempts, and Cawl has stated that he will acquiesce to Guilliman's demands. However, whether or not he truly means that is open to interpretation. For example, look at these lads. The Sons of the Phoenix, Primogenitor Rogel Dawn. With that paint job, and the battle cry, "From the fires of war we rise." And that chapter symbol as well. I'm not entirely sure that it's Dawn's blood that runs through these particular Primaris Marines. In fact, looking at their aesthetics, their love for candles, rituals, clean colors, and contrasts, yeah, I'm not at all convinced that there's fist in that Marine. And on that topic, I did actually do a video quite a while ago now, talking about what might happen if Traitor Gene-seed was used to create new Space Marines. I'll leave a link to that in the video description if you're interested in that, because a lot of them I don't think would necessarily be that big of a problem, whilst others would probably be a rather large problem. Oh, and speaking of problems, does anybody remember The Beast, that incredibly ridiculous, nonsensical attempt at recreating the Horus Heresy, essentially, but with orcs? God, it was horrible, absolutely dreadful. And it was also a big threat to the Imperium, but not a threat big enough for Cawl to unveil the Primaris Marines, interestingly enough. Of course, Guilliman has told Cawl to not release the Primaris Marines without his say-so, but Cawl has clearly already adopted Guilliman's approach to things, better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, so on. So I would not have been surprised if he had found some way to bend or reinterpret the rules, shall we say. However, the fact that he did not may indicate that he literally can not do so without Guilliman, some form of genetic lock, etc., or simply because he figured that they wouldn't be led by anybody but Guilliman. Or, of course, it's also possible that the authors simply hadn't thought about that whole Primaris thing whilst writing The Beast Arises. And to be fair, there were a lot of other things they didn't think about either whilst writing that heretical nonsense. And Guilliman too forgot about a few things. If indeed, as it seems to be the case, the Primaris Marines were locked away in such a fashion that only Guilliman could unlock them or authorize their release, then what would happen if Guilliman died? That's a bit of an issue, isn't it? Suddenly, the warp squirrel known as Cawl would wander across the galaxy building millions of Primaris Marines with no way to actually utilize them, which is a bit of a non sequitur in and of itself, since if Cawl can create them, and Cawl's the one who's sending them off to stasis across the galaxy, then surely he could simply just stop sending them off into stasis and use them during, for example, The Beast, or any other massive galaxy-threatening event, like countless Tyranids invasions, for example. The fact that Cawl is more than willing to basically go like, "Oh, no, Papa Smurf, I would never mix Traitor Marines into my Primaris," but at the same time would also go like, "What? Using the Primaris Marines too early? Without Daddy Guilliman's say-so? Impossible." It's a bit of a dumb one there. And yet another one as well. Guilliman instructed Cawl to create a device to essentially cure his own death, just in case, but how would that device ever actually be, applied? If Guilliman died, and Cawl wasn't right there to fix it immediately, then what? No, genuinely, then what? Is he going to just walk into the Ultramarine stronghold and go like, Hey, you, Chapter Master, would you turn off the stasis field keeping your Primarch alive so I can place this thingy-do on him? Trust me, it'll work out for the better. No. No, he's not going to do that. And in fact, he didn't do that either. It wasn't until he allied with the Eldar, whilst travelling in the company of the Black Templars. I hate the Gathering Storm. I genuinely hate the Gathering Storm, but moving on from that, it wasn't until the events of that ridiculous series of utter batshit occurred that Guilliman was finally released from the stasis chamber, and then Cawl, luckily being there at the time, hobbled over, attached a couple of jumper cables to Big G's nipples, and zapped him back to life. Just in time to inform him that, yep, you were right, Daddy Blue, the galaxy's been split in bloody two, and we need the hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Primaris Marines I've been squirreling away all these centuries. So, if you could just, give me your signature right here on the dotted line, I can start making legions again. A more clear-cut case of Keikaku fucking Dory I have not seen since Death Note. And on that note, Badum-tish, Cawl also, as mentioned, made lots of these guys. Lots and lots and lots and lots of Primaris Marines, just ready for Big Daddy to hit the button and release them out into the Imperium. How, precisely? Because this actually kinda seems like a bit of an impossibility, doesn't it? Let's for a second just forget the whole thing that Cawl did better than the Emperor with less time and less equipment. He also managed to store them by the thousands, by the chapters, by the legion, essentially, all across the Imperium. Think about that for a second. Cawl had no official support. Not from the Imperium, not from the High Lords, and certainly not from the Adeptus Mechanicus, who view Cawl as a dangerous renegade who is far too interested in such ridiculous ideas as innovation, reverse engineering, and scientific breakthroughs to be trustworthy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by and large, would not even deign to piss coolant fluid onto Cawl if he was currently overheating. And yet, he still managed to set up the infrastructure, including the vast quantities of energy required to build huge stasis chambers to contain thousands, indeed tens of thousands, of Primaris Marines. You would think that somebody would notice that kind of power expenditure, or the amount of materials required just to build the generators capable of actually providing that power, assuming that Cawl, of course, built it all from scratch, because, again, he couldn't have brought in any outside assistance whatsoever. So Cawl not only acquired all of the resources, but also built all of the equipment necessary. And even if we give him all of that, you'd think, once again, that someone, somewhere, would notice. Like, for example, oh hey, this is odd. There's an apparently dead asteroid out there with enough of a power signature to power your mum's dildo for a week. That's extraordinarily unusual. But no. Absolute secrecy. Nobody noticed. Oh, and by the way, natürlich. This isn't even the biggest problem, is it? The power? Oh my, okay, sure. Maybe he invented some kind of radically super efficient solar panels, maybe. Along, of course, with the cloaking equipment required to hide it from prying eyes. It sounds like a bullshit leap of logic, and in 40k in particular, yes, it absolutely is. But, once again, I remind you, he did better than the Emperor with less time and less resources, inventing a super powerful solar panel and the means to hide that energy production from the wider Imperium. He probably did that over tea and biscuits one afternoon. But again, that wouldn't even be the biggest problem. Oh no. Not even by a long shot. The biggest problem would be how to arm and armor these legions of super soldiers. There are entire, massive, hive city-sized factory complexes on Mars dedicated purely to the production of Space Marine weaponry, armor, and munitions. It is a huge undertaking, and of course it is made even huger by the active need to constantly resupply the Emperor's Astartes. Cawl would at least get around that, for the time being, but nevertheless, he must have produced, again, by himself, somehow, tens of thousands of fully functional, ready-to-be-utilized suits of Mark X power armor, which is even more advanced than the previous Marks, and far more modular as well, plus he also designed a bunch of different variants on that armor, since Mark X is designed to be, as mentioned, modular, allowing a Space Marine to take on the roles of heavy fire support, swift reaction forces, or infiltrators or tactical Marines, depending upon the situation. And anyone who has been anywhere near a modular system before will tell you that makes things a million times more complicated, especially as far as manufacturing is concerned, as all of those different modular parts will have to not only fit together, but also work and communicate with one another flawlessly to keep the rest of the power armored suit's functions up and running. And on this part, by the way, if Cawl had rocked out from the shadows during the collapse of Cadia, etc., and simply went, right, I've been given a mission by Guilliman to produce the next generation of weapons, sensors, armaments, and tactical power armor for the Astartes, I would have been totally happy with that. He had spent the last 10,000 years producing this masterwork of technology. He had done what nobody else in the Mechanicas could or wanted to do, and by doing so, he would massively increase the survivability and the firepower and the flexibility of the Astartes. If that was what he had done, I would have thought this was pretty damn cool. I would have thought this would have been a pretty damn proportional response, shall we say. I could have swallowed that easily enough. But of course, he didn't just do that. He didn't merely revolutionize every part of the Astartes arsenal, he also made the Primaris. Which further adds to my point of, who the fuck cares about this Emperor dude? What has he done that Cawl hasn't done 15 times better? This also, by the way, is why I actually like some of the new vehicles. The Repulsor tank, for example, is, in my opinion, an example of doing it right. I even made a whole video on this particular point. It is big, fat, bulky, and still clearly a Land Raider. And it doesn't do anything ridiculous. It doesn't reinvent the wheel and massively improve upon the wheel. It is simply a Land Raider with a more advanced form of propulsion, and that more advanced form of propulsion is nothing that the Imperium didn't have in the future. It's simply repulse technology, something the Imperium has over the millennia forgotten how to utilize. That is entirely acceptable. I have no problems with that whatsoever. But the Primaris Marines, again, that isn't merely an example of more advanced technology. That is an example of entirely new revolutionary technology created with seemingly diddly-dick-all effort, which I do have a problem with. Oh, and now that we've talked a bit about that, let us move on to another fluff point before then talking about their design, shall we? One of the biggest problems with the Primaris Marines are that they are diluting the already existing chapters. This is first and foremost a fluff point, which should not have happened. The Primaris Marines are being accepted into the chapters they supposedly sprung from remarkably easily. There have been some attempts to expand upon this fluff in various books, but by and large the Primaris are just kind of accepted, something I do not believe would ever have happened. The Dark Angels would never have accepted Primaris Marines in their ranks. They have far too much to lose by doing so, and they have far too little information on what the Primaris Marines are. Additionally, the Lion isn't dead. And for a chapter whose Primarch is not dead, he's merely sulking, essentially, to see these creatures produced from their sire's gene-seed, from their sire's materiel, without his permission, without their permission or knowledge, just show up like that. it should have led to an open firefight rather than anything else. Or, the most extreme example, the Blood Angels. The Blood Angels have the twin curses of the Thirst and the Rage, both of which stem from Sanguinius. The Rage, in particular, is brought on when a battle brother is overcome by visions of Sanguinius's death. It is seen as a proof of their bond to their Primarch, and those who succumb to the Rage are treated essentially as holy warriors, and also creatures to be pitied. They are to be given premier positions in any further offensive so that they may throw themselves at the enemy and end their own suffering. And yet the Primaris Marines do not suffer from the Rage, nor the Thirst, which as far as the Blood Angels is concerned should be undeniable truth that they are not sons of Sanguinius. For as much as the Blood Angels lament their curses, they also see them for what they are, a connection to their beloved Primarch. And any external force claiming to be of his blood and yet not suffering from these curses, I cannot imagine the Blood Angels would ever accept that. And even the most cooperative of chapters that aren't the Ultra Smurfs would at the very least have some serious concerns with the way in which this was done. Their Primarch's Gene-seed, the flesh and blood of their fallen brothers, utilized in some damn near close to heretic experiments to create these half-brothers, without their knowledge and certainly without their approval. That fact alone should send the Adeptus Astartes into a civil war. And that too leads me neatly on to the design aspect of this, because one of my really perhaps biggest issues with the Primaris is how kinda bland they are, and how they make everybody else blander by proximity. The Space Wolves were defined in large part by the Canis Helix. It's what gave them their special appearance, it's what gave them their backstory, their history, the Wurgen, etc. All of that stems from their history of Fenris and the Canis Helix. The Blood Angels, one of their unique units, is based upon their twin cursors. One of their primary characters, Mephisto, is the man who defeated these cursors. The Dark Angels and their secrets. All of this has no bearing on the Primaris Marines. They take all of these unique traits and just utterly ignore them, removing them entirely and replacing them with just standard vanilla Primaris Marines. This too is a problem in their design. The basic Primaris Tactical Marine just doesn't look that 40k. It's all rounded, smooth, elegant-looking surfaces, and it looks advanced. It doesn't look archaic in the slightest. You see tons of additional protection, layered plates of what appears to be sliding armor that would move as the Astartes move. The chest plate and the torso area in particular, instead of the usual bundle of power cables in the torso, near the stomach area, here you have smooth interlocking armored plates leading into the main chest piece, which is once again, as you can see, a modular piece of armor, where the main chest piece is made up of two pieces, and then there's a further, third, smooth, perfectly interlocking piece that forms the gorget and a part of extra protection for the chest. Even his backpack-mounted power unit, you can see, has been visibly smoothed out and rounded. Even the port to either side has had a apparently pointless piece of armor plastered onto the top to make them look less bulbous. And then there's the helmet. The standard Space Marine Vox Grill helmet is such an iconic part of the Space Marines. It makes them look archaic, and also violent, angry, offensive, dangerous. This new helmet, it's just a smooth, kind of slightly tilted faceplate. The only part that even really truly resembles the old helmet is the slanted eyes, set in kind of an angry-ish stare, but without the Vox grill, or without even the peaked nose, it just looks like a helmet. It doesn't look like the face of anger and destruction that the old Space Marines had. It's just a helmet. And this in and of itself wouldn't necessarily be all that bad if it weren't for the fact that they're also seemingly destroying the individuality of the various chapters' backstory. Overall, it seems like the Primaris Marines are just a nice big fat injection of, well, vanilla sci-fi. Less 40k, more basic bitch nonsense. A great deal of the charm for 40k for me was that the Space Marines, the Imperium's foremost defenders, the heroes of humanity, were also just as flawed as the humanity they were trying to protect. I mean, the Blood Angels are literal space vampires that occasionally go batshit insane and lose the ability to tell friend from foe. That's pretty flawed. And the Primaris, they don't have any of that. Hell, their one big flaw, the fact that they simply didn't have any battlefield experience at first and would have to rely entirely on hypno-suggestions to actually be useful on the battlefield, that flaw was simply just hand-waved away with the 100-Year Crusade, the Indomitus Crusade. Which, once again, wasn't a bad idea. The Indomitus Crusade was necessary, both to stabilize the Imperium and to give the Primaris Marines some combat experience, but the way it was done, the way it was implemented, was practically a line of fluff. And then Guilliman and his new friends went on a crusade to save the Imperium. The end. Is that all you got? Is that all you got? And that, too, is probably the underlying reason of all the problems with the Primaris Marines. They got the process completely turned around. The Primaris Marines should have been the epic climax of a long period of build-up, of hints, of stories, of experiments carried out by Cawl, his own long and painful journey towards knowledge and enlightenment, his seeking of that knowledge, his discovering of it, his evolution, his eureka moments, where he figured out how to do important things, etc. The failure of his attempt to create a Primarch, setbacks, progress, these things. It should have been a whole plotline. Instead, the Primaris Marines were just dumped in our laps with barely any preamble. And the preamble we did get, the Gathering Storm, well, hell, that wasn't even about the Primaris Marines. And the Gathering Storm was dumb enough as it is, too. Now, there is still a possibility that a lot of these flaws will be fixed in future stories. Chaos has already been looking at the Primaris Marines with eyes full of wet, longing envy, and perhaps, they will be proven to not be quite as perfect as they first appeared. If that is to be the case, then maybe this is the beginning of the story that I wanted to see. It'd still be a bit retarded because, well, the product's story will actually have occurred after the product, which sure as hell is not how I prefer things, but there is still a lot of room for improvements, particularly I think in the design department. I think they really need to have a long, hard think on what 40k is, and to try and incorporate more of that into the Primaris Marines. Less completely slick, clean surfaces, more battle scarring, more visible bolts or repairs, or maybe even just flat out more Imperial iconography. One of the issues with a lot of the new Primaris models is that their armor is so loud compared to the rest of the model that there's so many details on it that the details we would usually see on Astartes, the prayer scrolls, the reliquaries, the loincloths, all of that stuff, kinda drowns in the sound of the Primaris armor. It's too busy. It feels almost over-designed, and so in comparison, the more gothic touch of 40k kinda get lost a little bit. We need some more repulsor in the Primaris Marines, and a little bit less Primaris. Perhaps developing Cawl a bit more might also be a good idea, but honestly, he's already been developed a little bit too much in many cases. I've even been told now that apparently in one of his later books, and don't quote me on this one, this is literally off a super chat I received the same day that I finished this video, that apparently Cawl is some kind of peak hole for the God Emperor, which sounds... well, on the one hand, it would explain how he managed to make the Primaris so quickly, whilst on the other, it'd be also really crazy, considering that Cawl at this point is almost as much Necron tech and artificial intelligence as he is human. And somehow, I doubt that Big E would be overly happy with that. I think Cawl is starting to suffer from authoritis, where he is simply a character with too little story. Games Workshop realizes this and so sends him out to the authors, who all take a part of him, and then cobble together this Frankenstein mess of a monstrosity with 17 backstories. Bit of the problem I alluded to previously. But I will wrap up this video now. I know it's not been quite the vitriolic scree that you may have expected, but I figured I'd take a bit more of a balanced stance on the Primaris. There are parts of them that are still utterly fucking retarded, but I think honestly the primary problem I have with them is how vanilla they are. They need to be brought into the universe better. Something that could of course have been avoided quite easily if their backstory had been implemented gradually over the course of 2 or 3 years in a book series, instead of simply just dumped on the market like so much excess plastic. And so, until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope I'll be able to see you all again soon, maybe even in person. Indeed, because next week I will be attending ParadoxCon in Berlin, so if any of you are around there and you see a lost and confused Norwegian wandering through the hall scared of all the people surrounding him for the first time in many moons, then do feel free to say hello. I probably won't bite. Probably, never promise anything you don't know if you can keep. But that is entirely besides the point. Until next time, have a good day.